Hi, welcome back to my channel. It's nice to see you. I hope you're keeping well and keeping safe and staying at home. In order to fully understand how we got to the point we're at today with mental health care in the UK, we have to go right the way back to the earliest conceptions of mental health and mental illness. So, a good starting bit of context to have is that there have been four main conceptions of the etiology of mental illness through recorded historical time. The earliest conception of what caused mental illness was the supernatural origin theory. And this basically was the belief that mental illnesses were either gifts or curses from gods, or that they were caused by demonic possession or a person being possessed by another spiritual entity. The second theory of etiology was the somatogenic origin theory. And this basically stated that mental illnesses were caused by things going wrong within the body. So somatogenic generally means of bodily origin. So the thought process was that if something went wrong with one of the internal organs or internal structures, that could manifest in symptoms of mental illness. The third theory is the psychogenic origin theory. And this basically believes that mental illnesses were purely psychological. So it was nothing to do with any of the other bodily processes. It was just that something was going wrong with the psyche, with the mind, which was thought of as being quite a separate entity from the rest of the body. And then the final theory of etiology is the Biopsychosocial Model, which, if you've watched my other videos, you've definitely heard me mention before, because that is the most popular current theory of what causes mental illnesses. Okay, I just got a phone call, but I'm back and I'm going to try and remember where we were. So the biopsychosocial model is the current model that we work with, and it looks at the biological factors that influence the development of mental illness, the psychological factors just affecting the mind that affect the development of mental illness, and then also social factors. So this is the only theory that looks into your upbringing, your family unit, your relationships with friends and colleagues and other people, and your functioning as a social being. So this model takes into account something from most of the previous categories except the supernatural origin theory. Throughout this series, I'll make it clear at each point in history which model was the most popular at the time, and I think that'll help to give a lot of context to the different types of treatment and the social and scientific viewpoints on mental illness at that time. So, at the earliest points in history that we have records or artifacts from, it's difficult to find any written evidence of the treatment of mental illness that was used. But as far back as 6,500 BCE, we have bones that show evidence of what we believe to be the earliest treatment of mental illness. And this is called trepanning or trepanation, depending upon who's talking about it. There's a couple of different names. And what it generally involved was drilling into the skull, usually a fairly small round hole, and taking away that round piece of bone. Now those bones are usually referred to as rondelles, and there is some evidence that in certain cultures or certain places they were used as part of necklaces, and we're not entirely sure what those were used for, but it's pretty metal wearing a piece of somebody's skull as a necklace. So either way, from an aesthetic point, I'm kind of into it. We believe that the thought process behind trepanning or trepanation was to either release pressure from the brain or to release demons or any other supernatural entities that were inside the body that were causing the symptoms of mental illness that the person was exhibiting. And this practice wasn't limited to one particular culture. We've found skulls that have been carbon dated back to 6,500 BCE from multiple points around the world. So this seems to be something that lots of different groups that as far as we know, weren't interacting, were trying in order to relieve symptoms. There are caricatures from the Middle Ages that show trepanning being done to a person, ostensibly to relieve headaches at this point. But it's interesting because this isn't just an archaic thing that is no longer used. A similar practice is used in people who have brain injuries where the brain is swelling. Will remove part of the skull in order to allow the brain to kind of mushroom out until the swelling goes down, and that allows the person to survive the brain injury with much less brain damage than would have been caused if the brain had been swelling against the skull and didn't have anywhere to go. But we don't have much information to go along with these skulls from 6500 BCE. We're not sure exactly when it was used for people with mental illness, what particular symptoms would then be treated with this particular treatment. We have to wait until around 55 BCE for any records to appear that detail the particular symptoms that people were showing that were referred to as mental illness. 55 BCE is from the Roman occupation of Britain, and there is extensive evidence and extensive records from Roman scholars during this time. But it is worth remembering that there is always the potential for mistranslation and for misinterpretation of these records. So in order to understand what was going on in Britain during the time of the Roman occupation, we need to understand what the Romans' approach to mental illness generally was. There were no asylums, and all treatment of mental illnesses would occur either in the home or in temples. Before the 5th century BCE, the belief system was generally that of supernatural origin of mental illnesses. So during this period, it was generally believed that the symptoms of mental illnesses were either gifts or punishments from gods, and therefore the treatment should be to show devotion to the gods, often by sleeping overnight in a temple. A little bit later into the Roman occupation of Britain, around the 5th century, we also see the first shift from the supernatural origin theory to the somatogenic origin theory. Historians often give credit to this shift to the theories and work of Hippocrates. Now, if you work in the medical industry, if you have friends and family who do, or if you just watch a lot of medical TV shows, you've probably heard reference to the Hippocratic Oath, which is based on the teachings and beliefs of Hippocrates and is still one of the founding principles of medical practice today. Hippocrates was a firm believer in the somatogenic theory. He believed that all illnesses were due to dysfunction of the structures within the body. Alongside this, he also believed that treatment should be based upon the theory of the 4 humours. The 4 humours were based kind of around the theory of the 4 elements, but the elements of the body were believed to be black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And a dysfunction or an excess or deficiency in any of these humours was thought to be the cause of all physical and mental illnesses, so most treatments revolved around restoring balance between all these 4. For example, an excess of black bile was thought to cause melancholia, which we would now probably recognise as clinical depression. I'll put some links in the box below if you're interested in looking into treatments revolving around the 4 humours in more depth. But to give just an example, a few common treatments were temperature therapy, bloodletting, and the use of leeches. And each of these was thought to restore balance by either draining an excess of one of the 4 humours or encouraging the body to produce more of another. While these treatments might not sound hugely accurate to us now, Hippocrates' work actually went a long way to encouraging the rational treatment of illnesses and also towards including diet, exercise, and empathy or bedside manner in the treatment of illnesses by doctors. Hippocrates did have his critics though, even in Roman times. Asclepiades, in around the 2nd century BCE, criticised Hippocrates' over-reliance on the body's natural ability to heal itself from illnesses. He observed that around 50% of the cases that Hippocrates treated ended in death, and he believed that there must be a better way of approaching the treatment of illnesses. He actually called Hippocrates' approach a meditation on death. But because we're focusing on the treatment of mental illnesses, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on how Asclepiades treated physical illnesses, but he does seem to have been the first person to use music therapy to treat what we would now recognize as mental health problems. Interestingly, even though popular Roman scholars were starting to shift from the belief in supernatural origins to somatogenic origins, it seems that popular opinion and the opinion of the public took a lot longer to shift. There's an interesting quote by the historian William V. Harris that summarizes a common classical opinion of morality and social function. He suggests that there was a general belief that the essence of good behavior is self-control. I find this really interesting because it suggests that anything uncontrollable, such as certain symptoms of mental illness, indicated a personal moral failing or flaw. I'm highlighting this because I feel like this is still a pervasive idea and a common opinion today. We can see it in phrases like snap out of it or pull yourself together, or the one I hate most, just man up. It's also interesting because in shifting from belief in a supernatural origin of mental illness to a somatogenic origin, we've jumped straight from having a very external locus of control in gods into having a completely individual responsibility for one's own actions, even when you're suffering from a health problem. There aren't yet any social theories of the influence of parenting or one's early environment, and that leaves all the symptoms of mental illnesses to be controlled, overcome, or masked by the individual themselves. So, we've seen the beginnings of medical treatment of mental illness in Roman-occupied Britain, but what about Anglo-Saxon Britain? This period is from the 5th century CE until about the 8th century CE, and I got very excited whilst researching this period because this is when we see our first medical manuscripts. There were 4 main manuscripts that I found reference to, and they were Bald's Leech Book, the Third Leech Book, the Lachnunga, and the Old English Herbarium. If there are any historians out there who are cringing at my pronunciation, please do let me know if I've said something wrong. I tried to research it as much as I could, but it's quite difficult to get Old English pronunciation correct. One of the most interesting things I found in Bald's Leech Book was a reference to the thought that a diseased stomach could cause anxiety and sadness without reason. As someone with celiac disease, I can definitely attest to the fact that having digestive issues can cause anxiety and depression, but I mainly found it interesting because the majority of our serotonin is actually produced in our stomach. That's why when starting to take an SSRI for the first time, you can feel queasy and like you've got butterflies in your stomach because of the increase of serotonin. But it's fascinating to me that, whether by coincidence or not, a manuscript from somewhere between the 5th and 8th century CE makes reference to the connection between the mind and the gut. I think we as humans are generally pretty good at trying to find ways of easing suffering, even if we're not 100% sure where that suffering comes from. And that definitely causes issues along the way, because if you don't know exactly what you're treating, you're less likely to be particularly accurate. But it's also encouraging to know that people have been trying to help each other, and people have been trying to help people with mental illnesses for this long. At this point in time, we do also see that the majority of treatment was still carried out in the home, and often healers or herbalists would actually visit people in their own homes rather than people going to them, particularly if someone was suffering from an acute episode of what would have been called lunacy at that point. The majority of the treatments in Bald's Leech Book and in the Third Leech Book, the Lachnunga and the Old English Herbarium, were mostly focused around treating periodic lunacy rather than illnesses that were consistently symptomatic. Things that we would now recognise as being an acute psychotic episode or bipolar mania, for example, seemed to garner the most attempts at treatment. I think because they were probably both the most disabling for the person experiencing it and the most disruptive for their community at the time. Unfortunately, as we still often see, people whose illnesses are quieter or directed more internally didn't seem to gather as much support or as much active research for things that would help. Another thing I noticed from these texts, though, is that there was a fascinating blend of paganism and Christianity, at least within the extant texts that I had access to. This is indicative of the often cited blending of beliefs at this point in Anglo-Saxon England, and it's fascinating to see that the cures that were proposed also have this blended religious and supernatural approach. The cures tended to blend herbal medicine with Christian liturgy, blessings, and exorcism, where the herbs were intended to act upon the physical body, and the Christian practices would cast out any demons that were either causing or adding to the person's suffering. It's almost like a covering all your bases approach, which I think is really interesting, particularly given that these are from a time when it would have been very difficult to measure the effect of the treatment that you were giving to somebody. As much as Asclepiades didn't like it, sometimes the only way you can see if a treatment for mental illness is working is to watch and wait. But the Anglo-Saxons definitely weren't messing around with trying one thing at a time. They threw the whole kitchen sink at it and then watched and waited to see if it worked. Which I appreciate their enthusiasm, but it does make it very difficult to pinpoint exactly what worked, and that's probably why we see so much consistency in the blending of pagan and Christian approaches, because if something worked, they had no real way of telling what it was, so they just kept trying everything. Interestingly though, in these Anglo-Saxon texts, there doesn't seem to be any reference to excluding a person suffering from mental illness, and there doesn't seem to be any reference to the judgmental or the feeling of that person having a moral failing kind of approach that we saw in classical Roman Britain. There was definitely still fear directed towards the supernatural beings that might be causing it, but at least in these texts, that doesn't seem to have been equally directed to the person who was affected. Throughout history, it's very interesting to watch the opinion of the public towards mentally ill people shift backwards and forwards between understanding and empathy and fear and almost a displaced anger. So, we have now reached the 8th century, and here I gained 2 new sources of research: legal texts and literary manuscripts. You may wonder what legal texts have to do with the historical treatment of mental illness, but they offer some very interesting insight, primarily into decisions about mental capacity, control of finances and estates, and the responsibility of care. We also find examples of the first legal decisions about whether or not a person was responsible for actions that were taken whilst they were deemed clinically insane. These give us a really interesting indication about societal opinions on the mentally ill, and they also set a legal precedent which influenced decisions for hundreds of years afterwards. Literature, on the other hand, offers us descriptions of behaviours and symptoms that were seen by others as indicating mental illness. We get descriptions of patterns of illness that were written about by different authors, but that seem to show the same symptoms. And we often then get the author or the character's commentary on how this was seen by those around them. Through the lens of current diagnostic systems, the symptoms presented seem to fall into 3 main categories: affective disorders, psychosis, and dissociative disorders. Within literature, we also get evidence of the societal efforts to understand mental illness. Lycanthropy, witchcraft, and vampirism can all be read as allegories of mental illness and societal or social attempts to understand them. For example, lycanthropy is often read as an allegory for recurrent psychotic symptoms. And now we reach the moment that I'm sure you've all been waiting for: the implementation of the first asylums. But it's not Bethlehem, and it's not actually in the UK. The first asylum was actually built in Baghdad in 705 CE by Al-Razi. Again, I'm sorry if I butchered that name, but he was apparently one of the greatest Islamic physicians. There's a really common misconception that mental health care was founded by Western physicians and Western scholars, and that's not true at all. The second asylum was built in Cairo in 800 CE, and it built upon a long tradition of Egyptian innovation in healthcare and mental health care. From what I could find, the UK was actually really slow on the uptake in terms of mental health care and in terms of when our first asylum was built. Bethlehem was built in 1247, but it didn't actually start accepting patients until 1377. Previous to that, for the 130 odd years, it was actually a priory. So it did assist the poor, but it wasn't a psychiatric hospital. The UK was very much not leading the field, and that is something that you will continue to see throughout the rest of this series. At least one other hospital founded in Damascus in 1270 CE came before Bethlehem. For now, I'll leave you with the image of at least 4 psychiatric hospitals across the globe, and probably others that either I haven't come across or that history has unfortunately forgotten. Next time, we'll pick up speed with more surviving records of mental health care from the High Middle Ages up to the early modern period. Expect Shakespeare and a few surprises. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this and ring the bell to be notified when the next episode goes live. I'll see you soon. Bye!